What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right. Welcome everyone to episode 27 of Reframing the Narrative. And really excited this week to talk about a really important subject that I think is long overdue. And I've had versions of this conversation with people in the past, and certainly now counting about 4 years ago at a freedom meeting during the scamdemic. I had given a many little speech on this subject, and Jake and I had talked about making this an actual episode for our weekly podcast. And so here we go. We're going to talk about the power of words and how words have meaning. And Jake, good to see you as always. Wanted to let you tee this off because I know you have some thoughts about where to start this conversation.
All right. Thanks, PJ. I really love this subject, and it's something that we both had in mind to kind of tackle for quite some time. I think it's going to be a real banger, as some of my favorite podcasters like to say. So, without further ado, uh, the power of language and words is something that we see used, like you just used the word scamdemic, right? Pandemic. I still hear that word, and it just irks me. It just makes my skin crawl every time I hear it. I get the heebie-jeebies, and I just want to say, there was no pandemic. And so that brings to mind when we use words and why we use words and how we use them. We won't go specifically into that, but maybe when we're wrapping up, I think we're going to go into certain words and terms that we would prefer not to use any longer. So we'll get there. And pandemic is certainly one of those. But we can think about what it means when people use terms such as pandemic and um, and even contagion or virus or all sorts of terms that could be replaced with others or concepts that we could use others to replace, and we might be in a better place if we do. And I think back to one example in my personal life, which was I was living in Taiwan. Just full disclosure, I lived most of my adult life in Taiwan. A little bit about me. And I was experiencing something with the use of the term for Mandarin that was prevalent in Taiwan by the government. Now, the government in Taiwan is kind of an occupying government in a way that's it's kind of grown local roots over the generations, but it literally was a conquering, occupying, quasi-colonial force that came from China when the nationalist government lost the civil war with the communists over that founded the PRC, People's Republic of China. And their term for Mandarin is national language, 国语, 国 national 语 language. And I found that there was this power in those terms because you had a government that came from the outside, and they're telling people that are learning this language, because it wasn't the native language of the people that were resident in Taiwan at the time that the government came in there. And they started using this, and it was one way of really fixating the attention of the population and their consciousness on this Chinese national identity that they didn't have at the time. So, without getting too much into Taiwan's history, uh, they had been alienated and separated from China for 50 years during a previous occupation by the Japanese. And so, this is important for the occupying national government that wanted to kind of tame the people They use this term national language for Mandarin. And that's all they taught in the schools. And they fine people for speaking their native tongue in class. They literally put a dunce cap on them. And I started telling everybody in my life, you're a native speaker of your dialect or your language, Taiwanese. Guoyu, national language, is Chinese. And I saw the change in their consciousness. It was really powerful. And I did that with my ex-wife. I did that with all my friends that would listen. I was like, what? Have you ever given any thought to that? National language, isn't that kind of like a Jedi mind trick here? And they would come around and say, yeah, you know what? I think you're right. I grew up speaking our local language or dialect. And that really made a light bulb come on for me and those people that reached that kind of a level of consciousness as well. And they started being more, I think, more aware of the power of language in those terms. And also, they were more conscious about using their native tongue because they already were fluent Mandarin there, and they became more conscious of just maybe the endangerment of their own native tongue because of policies like that. And that brings to mind the politicization of words and how they can be used by official channels and media as well, and all sorts of forces. Another really important example that comes to mind for me is something that hit my radar around the same time that I was becoming aware of the whole use of Mandarin, Goyu for Mandarin, national language, was gender replacing sex. And maybe you can relate what your experience and your awareness of that was, but just for me, um, I thought it was very odd because it was always just you're either of one sex or the other. And yeah, of course, there's English has a ton of homonyms, and I think we'll get to that as well. Homonyms and synonyms as well. And so we have sex being the act of sex and procreation, and then we have the sex of male or female, and that's it. And when the agenda started coming around, it was very subtle at the time. We used to have transsexuals, not transgenders, and we'd call them trannies, right? Um, and that's fine. They existed back in the day. But when the term gender started being used, that's a grammar term. It's not a biological term. And then when that replaced the biological term of sex for male and female, it allowed a lot of, let's say, fuzzy logic room for fudging with the term and the definition of gender. And now here we are many years later, and it's basically been redefined as a social construct. So we have terms such as gender assigned at birth. I mean, how Orwellian can you get, right? So I'll just keep my opening comments to those two aspects: the power of really becoming aware of the power of words, and then also the example of gender versus sex in my observations in the last couple decades.
Yeah, so much there that you brought up, but I think we should go back to kind of the root of words and how they do have meaning and power, and thinking about even the word spelling. What is that really telling us? That you are casting a spell by what you're writing down and what you're saying, that the words really do have a lot of power and meaning to them. And even more so, this is something I heard in a recent podcast, and I think it's really appropriate because beyond spelling, spelling leads to creating imagination. And what is the word imagination really telling you? But it's telling you that it's magi over a nation, it's magic over a nation, imagination. So all these words have deep roots throughout history that if you really look into them, you realize they're conveying a certain message, even if they may seem benign. And that's where I think it really is important for us to really consider the words that we're using. I brought up scamdemic earlier because I personally refuse to ever use the word pandemic because I know better. I know that there was no such thing, that even the use of the term "it's going viral" encourages the idea that viruses are real and that they're invading people and that there's big bad germs out there to get everyone. And so it's much as we've talked about in this podcast already, that when we use these words, we give consent to a concept or to a framework. And we really have to consider that when we use these words, that we are in some sense giving our, not only our attention and our mind to those words, but we're condoning something that's a societal construct that we don't necessarily have to. And so we can choose our own alternative words to redefine the way that we're talking about something. Even I personally refuse to ever say the word global. I might say across the world or something of that nature or in our realm, but I personally reject the notion that we're living on a spinning ball, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour and everything else that we've talked about. But that's a choice. There's alternatives that we can use within our conversation that make it clear we don't consent to the paradigms that have been forced on us. And you brought up gender as well, and I think it has been a very slow walk towards this overall agenda that we see now, where because sex, or because gender was a replacement for the word sex, then we started blending terminologies, and suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where an embryo suddenly becomes a clump of cells, and it's, something that's nearly born can be a choice and not a human being. And I think these are all considerations for how language is important, and our word choices really do matter.
They really do. You brought up a really good point about just kind of passing on when you use a term like pandemic. There's an opportunity, by the way, when you speak of things like something that others in general speak of, like the pandemic. There's an opportunity to avoid using it. There's also an opportunity to use an alternate term that might kind of mess with people's minds. Um, but that's kind of like we're passing something along. Every time we use it, it's received and you're taking it. And if you just accept it, like this is your term, do you accept it? Yeah, okay. I can't think of anything better. I'm going to use this term. So you pass it along. So that's one additional reason we need to be really conscious about our use of words and concepts. And personally, when it comes to the term pandemic, I never use that. And if I refer to that period of 2020, 2021, especially 2021 was actually like worse than 2020 because they had rolled out the clot shots and there was so much pressure to just cave and take those. And then there was all the abuse and the hassles and in just getting around in the public spaces rather than distancing and all that retarded kind of behavior. They wanted to see your vax ports or whatever it was. So I like to take the opportunity when I have the chance and something comes up from that point. I will talk about house arrest instead of lockdowns. I will use the term the malarkey because it's kind of a cute term.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And humor is always really a good little device to use when you're talking about things instead of being real serious about stuff like there was no pandemic. Well, fine. If somebody listens to you, great. Otherwise, you're going to sound like Alex Jones, when you say something like that. You might turn a few people off, but if you use humor and kind of go, yeah, that was a crazy time, right? Back during that malarkey. And you might just make people think twice about what you're talking about and give it a little more thought.
Yeah, it really is amazing how many words have been inserted into our nomenclature that commercialize the way we speak to each other or politicize how we think and how we converse with each other. It just came to mind that even something like you sneeze and someone says you want a Kleenex, well, that's actually a brand name. People don't say, do you want a facial tissue? Likewise, if you want to go do a search online, what do people say? They say Google it. Well, they're branding something, right? They're passing a brand along. So that's just one more example of the wizardry that happens with words and how powerful they can be and how you can control a space in people's minds. And it's funny because you had just said something a minute ago that made me think of even a situation earlier today where I was in an office environment and I made a light joke about speaking Spanish like a slow kindergartner. But inside of me, I really wanted to say retarded because I think it's a funny word. And, we become so PC now, you can't even say that. But, I think there is a fine line, certainly, of sensitivities, but there's words that we're encouraged to use and words that we can't use and words that are pushed on us. And we have to make the choice of which of those words to adopt for ourselves and communicate. And also not only communicate where we stand and what we mean, but who we are as people. And I think that's also really important. But I'll just wrap up this comment by saying that I really do want to bring, and especially with the Bostonian accent, I really do want to bring retarded back, but you have to say it like a Bostonian and say retarded because they just do it best. But with that, I'll volley back to you, Jake.
If I could stop laughing, I'll make a comment. To your comment about spelling, one of the lyrics that comes to mind when it relates to the power of words is something I just sang off air to you, and that's by Depeche Mode. And this is going to be my singing debut on Reframing the Narrative. Words like violence break the silence, come crashing into my little world. Right? It's a Depeche Mode song, and I find it really interesting that one of their albums is called Speak and Spell as well. And I was just mulling on that. It's not from the same record, but it's that was one of their albums, and we can get into the whole pop culture and how that has effects on people's consciousness and beyond as well. So that's "Enjoy the Silence" is probably my favorite pop song actually, and there's just a real vibe to it that is heavy. That's not typical of a pop song. And I think that's for a reason because it really is, it has weighty lyrics. So I invite our listeners to go back to that song from the, wow, late 80s, actually. Awesome album. Yeah. And I'm not really sure if it's unique to English. I am bilingual. And I think the more you become familiar with other languages, the more you'll know how to play around with those languages and do things like use puns. There's definitely punning in Mandarin Chinese, but it's really different. And I won't get into the specifics of Mandarin, but in my former life as a copywriter, I would use some Chinese puns as well. But they're very different. And I think there's something unique about English. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it almost seems like a constructed language. And as we get more into, and I'll use this word deliberately, globalism, uh, English takes on greater importance and meaning in the world. And even if it isn't used, or if even if people grow up with English as a second language, it is increasingly important in more and more people's lives as a second language and as a carrier or vehicle of cultural information. There's an interesting word, information. And um, so I I can't quite put my finger on it. I'm not a linguist in that sense, and I'm not really super versed in etymology, not entomology, right? I better get that right. Uh, One's the study of bugs, and but I always found it really interesting for learners of English as a foreign language. They have to deal with so many homonyms, and I was just thinking of a couple earlier today um, as I was turning onto Park Street. I was thinking, wow, I might stop at the park on Park Street, or I might park my car there, or maybe a Bostonian would say I might park my car there. And then, there's a, a really nice one is light, light being illumination and being low in weight or not heavy. There's so many. You can go on a date, but what date do you choose to go on it? Another really good one would be current or currency, right? Uh, Current flows down a river and it's directed by the bank, right? The river banks. So we see a bunch of these certain plays on words all over our language, and especially when you get into, and I think we're probably not going to touch on it too much today, but when you get into the idea of getting back to the root of not referring to people by gender, but by their sex as male and female, men and women, as sovereign humans, then the natural law type terms are overtaken by terms such as currency, birth, homonyms like birth, birth, and then berth, where a ship is comes to rest and is docked. And I just find this really interesting. And I'm not sure if it's unique to English, but I have a pretty sneaking suspicion that it is unique to English.
Well, I'll take the conversation a slightly different direction, at least for a detour, and then get us back on track because you were bringing up the uniqueness of English. And one idea I've heard, and I'm not saying that I necessarily subscribe to it, I hold it in my mind as a possibility, but one theory that I have heard amongst those of us who believe in the little season and a former millennial reign that perhaps English was derived from the tongue of angels or Anglican. And if you think about one of the earliest translations of the Bible, the Tyndale Bible was actually Old English, which, if you try to read it, it's quite difficult because their version of English was so different than our modern day. And perhaps the uniqueness of English was intentional, that it doesn't flow from other languages such as the Romance languages, which are very similar. And when you know one, you know the others pretty closely by default. But there is this notion that perhaps during the millennial reign there was a new tongue of angels that then was around after the reign was over and then got distorted into the version of English we have today. Now, I can't say whether that's true or not. It's speculation, but it's just an interesting another way to look at the very complex language that we have that's unique relative to many of the other languages in the world, and just something to consider. But certainly there have been a lot of distortions to the language and a lot of ways to create confusion through the language, as you just gave an example of park and the many uses of the word park. I'm sure if we had done more homework and spent the past week looking at roots of words and their histories, we'd have more
But I
insight
did.
and more insight to give to our listeners about where some of these words come from. But I think our listeners get the point, and I think this may be potential segue to get back into the words that we feel maybe should be retired from here on in. But let me just give the mic back to you, Jake, and let you comment on that last string.
Well, certainly the term angle and its relation to angels is it's something that a lot of people actually confuse, which is interesting. But then again, I don't give people too much credit when they can't even get there and there, or it's and it's correct. But then again, it kind of makes sense to go it apostrophe s for possessive. Wouldn't it make sense? No, that's not the way it is, but it drives me nuts anyway. But getting back to that, yeah, it's the Anglican the that angle to the origins of English is really intriguing. And is it an angelic language? And what are angels? That's definitely something worth thinking about. Um, but I kind of wanted to ask you, so putting you on the spot, PJ, what terms have you become aware of their power, and in a sense that you either didn't want to use them or you wanted to use them correctly, and or maybe wanted to retire and have replaced with other terms?
Yeah, well, certainly we touched on one of those already, being that I refuse to use the word pandemic because I don't want to acknowledge that scam, whether we're talking about 2020 or the Spanish flu or name your fake pandemic. But I think there's other words that we use on a regular basis that we need to retire permanently, and one that comes to mind is the word evolve. How many times do people use evolve in some context? And I know what they're trying to say is progress something, or get it to the next generation or level, or what have you. But using that word is giving consent that we agree that there was something such as evolution, that we do ultimately come from some speck of nothing that turned into everything all at once, and all the nonsense that's involved in that. And I think that if we really give this some thought in the words we use, instead of saying evolve, we could say advance. It's a really simple substitution, and I'm not saying that's the only choice of words, but that's just an example where we're giving consent to a paradigm, and a paradigm that I'm sure I've spoken of this in past episodes, but the whole confluence of evolution, Big Bang, heliocentricity, all of those concepts came from the same general time period and same general cadre of Freemasons and Jesuits. And we're just all consenting to it by some of these words that we're using, which is why I circle back to the use of the word global, or uh, as I mentioned, evolve is another one, or even saying something like calling someone a dinosaur who's really old. Again, dinosaurs is another part of that whole mid 1800s ish paradigm of trying to turn divinely created people into monkeys in a meaningless world. And extending even beyond that, thinking about saying, oh, we're going to nuke them back to the Stone Age or something like that, or using the word Stone Age, that again implies that we were Neanderthal people at some point in a cave, and clueless. And I think that anyone in this community who has looked closely into our history in the old world quickly realizes that the past man was much more advanced than we are today. We celebrate the use of chips and things that operate off of chips and electricity, but I think there's clear evidence that mankind actually used free energy and had a lot better architecture and view of art in the world and the synchronicity in nature than we ever have in our quote unquote modern age. But again, we use some of these words such as Stone Age or dinosaur or caveman, or calling an idiot a Neanderthal or something of that nature. We're consenting to it all. We're saying subliminally we agree with that paradigm.
Yeah, just look at the town of Bedrock. I mean, the Flintstones, they had a great lifestyle, right? So we shouldn't be dissing the Stone Agers back in the day.
Who also had their Stone Age Mason Club, if you'll recall from some of those cartoon episodes.
Password.
Ack, a dack, dack, a ack.
Enter, brother.
I'm definitely a Bam Bam fan for sure. Yeah, Fred Flintstone actually reminds me of back in the day. He was the Archie Bunker of the cartoon world, right? Male head of a family who was just not as strong and capable as he should have been. And he was just open for mocking by the females in his life. And that you can see that agenda, just that feminist agenda, just starting to really attack the male head of a family in that era, because there is about the same time as Archie Bunker, All in the Family, and the Flintstones. So just because it's a cartoon doesn't mean it's innocuous, and that goes for all the way up to South Park and Family Guy and all those funny shows that are and the Simpsons, of course, that kind of show us a peek into reality every once in a while.
Well, even think
Yeah.
about some of the shows from back in the 60s and 70s that were conditioning people to believe in space and space exploration. How many people do you know who were big Star Trek fans and or Star Wars fans? So much so that they would fight each other over which one was better, but at the end of the day, they were all being conditioned to believe in this idea of this fantasy space that they could go out and explore, not realizing the reality of the world that's around us. And that's even more reason for us to really think through how we describe even things related to space or NASA and their fakery, or saying astronaut. I call them astronauts. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. But there's a lot of these terminologies that we just again consent to these paradigms, especially for NASA, that's been proven many times over to be faking space and lying and sucking up billions of dollars, along with encouraging people to believe that they are a cosmic accident. But if we just think about all the different words that they put out there to ensnare us into their way of thinking, they're numerous. And I was just actually, I'll say as an aside, having this conversation at a gathering last night, that taking the idea of the power of words a step further, thinking about NASA and the stage that they create for the world to be under their spell. Think about, for those who are old enough to remember the Challenger explosion, the TVs were all wheeled into the classrooms so that we could all witness it at the same time and be shocked and traumatized by it.
Totally.
And that's just one more example of how that was put on for all of us to be under their spell. And so it's not just words, it's the things we see on the screen, but these things work together.
Yeah, it's a really good example of just mass mind control at that time. And it makes me wonder more about the fakery involved in 9/11. The first explosion, I won't even say the first plane, possibly, whatever. There's sleight of hand. You can actually do something and do something else at the same time that's really causing the issue. But then personally, for me, hearing that a plane had gone into the trade centers while I was listening, I was actually listening to the radio at that time in the morning, and I was in New York, and I heard, and then of course I went and turned on the Talmud Vision, and then I swear I saw the second plane smashing into the South Tower, and then of course one thing follows the other. But just the fact that so many people were tuned in to the Challenger explosion. I was actually in university at the time, and we did the same thing. We stopped our class and we all gathered and we watched what was coming through the television at the time. And it was like this spell. And we can debate what the meaning of that was for the rest of time. But I think one message was that space is dangerous and we can't get there. And it was really quite a feat that we got there in 1969 and through the other Apollo missions. But for some reason, we lost the technology, and we'd go back in a nanosecond if we could rebuild it, but we won't because it's just too hard. But India went back with their Atari, and China went back on the dark side. But anyway, those terms like evolution are, it's really important when you have a chance to correct yourself and use something else. I think it makes a really a big difference. You can set that ripple effect going in your own life. And if you have a bigger platform, then you can also have an impact on people, just as really setting an example for yourself with your own behavior. And I think that's something that we've been stressing together on this show. It's really not trying to tell people what to do. We're just trying to bring things to people's attention. And then uh, we really respect their autonomy and their discernment to do what they, to the best of their ability at the time and their judgment, to make a good decision. And I've seen the power of just taking personal responsibility and making changes in my life without having to proselytize, without having to go out and tell people all about my life and you should be doing this or you should be doing that. I just make a change in my life and people are curious. For instance, diet. I made a change. I lost 35 pounds. People are asking questions. Now I have an opportunity to talk about what I've been doing without telling them that you should be doing this or you should be doing that. And I will say that I always mentioned and stress that this is what's working for me. It might not for you. But that's just an example of just incorporating a behavior once it reaches that point of, okay, I'm aware of this. Well, okay, you are a human being. You have this incredible God given gift to change your behavior and incorporate these changes in your life. So if you don't do that, that's not honoring that gift of consciousness and discernment. And that's not something that I want to do. I want to be able to honor that. And that's one of the joys of and wonders of life, and this journey of life is finding things to become aware of and make changes and see how they affect things. It's one of the coolest things in my personal life.
Totally agreed. And just to change gears a little bit about the power of words, I was just thinking about how the powers that shouldn't be, or the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, the controllers, they always love to put things in plain sight, hide them in plain sight for those who can discern them to understand what they're actually communicating, and for uh, the masses who don't, for them to essentially be mocked by it. And they also believe in this revelation method, that they're telling you what they're going to do or showing you something so that they somehow, in their view of karma, get away with it for basically getting everyone's consent. And I was thinking about that concept, and all the things that are put in our face where it's very overt. But even I was thinking about a great example of your neck of the woods, where there's a team called the Giants. And I think about how that's a subtle nod to the Nephilim, who lived here amongst us at some point in human history, and whose spirits, you know, cause havoc here in absence of a body. But I had never really thought about it before. Where do some of these even sports teams names come from, and why are we giving them energy, in a sense, by putting them up on a pedestal. And I just thought of the Giants example, but there's certainly many more. And there's the obvious numerology that's put out on the news, 33 deaths or 33 this or 33 that. There's certain names and terms they like to throw out there, but it's interesting to really think through what are the ones that are more subtle for the people who know a little bit more about our history and the old world that they're just putting out there and sort of their own homage to what they feel was a better time.
That's a really interesting point. We also have the Angels, right? In the same state. But did you know the origin of the Brooklyn Dodgers slash LA Dodgers? It's kind of hilarious. Speaking of terms, how they the origin of terms.
Well, no, maybe I don't. Why don't you enlighten us?
All right, this is a segue, but it's kind of funny, or maybe going down an alternate route for a moment. Waze loves to do that, so we're taking Waze now. The Brooklyn Dodgers were called the Dodgers because there were so many surface level, kind of like in San Francisco, actually, cable cars all over Brooklyn. And you would have to wait to cross the street, but if you were impatient, you would have to dodge the cable cars coming through the streets of Brooklyn. And so they were named as an homage to the people who dodged the cable cars in Brooklyn. It's a funny name, but yeah, why would a professional sports team be called the Giants if there were no Giants? Well, maybe there's something to that. Yeah, really funny. And I'm not a fan, so I can't speak too much more about that one. I wanted to mention another thing, which is just the name Hollywood. They named a town after the type of wood that's made from the holly tree. It was a magician's wand, right? So it's sorcery. It's right out there. So you're speaking about revelation of the method, and they tell you what they're doing. And Hollywood, just right from the outset, just said, we're all about sorcery, not just magic, which has its own connotations. But I think sorcery is another level or takes magic to another level. Magic for me can be about wonderment and about maybe a mystery, where sorcery has an edge of darkness and maybe non-disclosure, like it's done surreptitiously behind closed doors in the dark. And we we see that Hollywood is a major vehicle for purveying agendas and setting consciousness, establishing consciousness, making through the power of suggestion. When people see something through a screen for some reason or another, many reasons, their their guard is let down and they're more suggestible, and that isn't entirely due to the flicker rate or things that are related to the entrancement of viewers. I think it just comes from the state that we're in when we sit down and we want to turn our brains off in that sense, and we find ourselves talking about that. Like, I I've had it for today. I've worked hard enough. I've been through enough. My client asked me to do this or that, or I sent an invoice 30 days ago and I still haven't heard back, and I got to chase this invoice down. I just want to turn my brain off. Well, what are you doing? You're opening yourself up to whatever comes through that box or that rectangle, whatever the shape of that screen is. And those that make the programs, there we have another term, right? Programming. Um, they're fully aware of that. And the power of suggestion is just incredibly potent. And I think we can even go back uh, to look at the iterations. I won't use the term evolution, but you can see how certain behaviors that were definitely taboo on the big screen were introduced slowly but surely, and it was just like boiling the frog. And people have become accustomed to almost, I love the term from Clockwork Orange, ultra violence, right? Uh, Maybe there was just a little hint of violence, like Hitchcock. You almost never see anybody actually getting the axe, but you see the blood going down the drain. You see the expression on the person's face, and then it gets escalated over time. And the same thing with sexual mores. The same thing with introducing um, different uh, sexual identities uh, over the years. And I became aware of that, especially acutely aware of it when I was still renting videos from Blockbuster, maybe 20 years ago, when almost every show, I would rent a show and binge watch because you had like a week to watch the entire season. You rent the season, you binge watch it. And I noticed that there would always be male, a gay male character who would be like the best friend of the females. It's almost like a female cannot understand what the other females are going through. And a normal, not, I won't say normal, a heterosexual male cannot possibly understand what the women are going through. So they're the one that is most sympathetic and most understanding of them is like the gay Jewish guy on Sex in the City. And I don't remember his name. And I hated that show to begin with, but my ex-wife liked to watch it. Go figure. And then you get um, from that, you go to like 6 Feet Under, which was around the like 2005 to 2008, something like that, around 20 years ago. And you get uh, homosexual male, and that's fine. There are homosexuals in the world. I don't have any problem with homosexuals, that identity. But the promotion of characters in every single show, you get this son, the scion of this family, at a funeral parlor, and he's got um, his partner, and they're not just holding hands. They're doing a lot more than that, and it's just like one step at a time. It's incremental, and then pretty soon you're seeing like straight on sex scenes, homosexual sex scenes, just like you did with heterosexual sex scenes that were incrementally introduced as well on the silver screen. Yeah. So yeah, it's just we're on this ride, and it pays to be conscious of what they're introducing at each step.
Absolutely. And I think, well, first of all, I have to give a shout out to Medicine Girl for her recent series on Hollywood and the spell that they weave on people. And she made a really good point about the way the human brain is wired, that we don't just watch things as entertainment, we mirror them in our minds, that we become those characters, and our mind replicates it as our own experience, as part of our taking this in. So all of those creeping agendas that you just described were on purpose and put out there for us to then mirror in our own minds, and assimilate in some ways as part of our reality. And that's just an extension of what we were talking about earlier in this episode, that it's not just words, it's what you take in and how you use them and how you communicate. And that's just, as you say, that's one form of communication, but it's a one way communication in a state where we've chosen to lower our defenses and take in whatever we're viewing. But then that our brain is wired to not just see it, but to process it and make it become part of us. And I think that's a really important point for us all to consider. Again, we all make our choices where to engage in a lot of that, and where to turn our backs. But it's just a really good point that anytime we're engaging in any of that so-called entertainment, we are inviting those thoughts and those norms and those concepts into our mind. We can still choose to reject them, but they've become interwoven in our brain and in our thinking in some way.
Yeah, in a way, we're participants. And if you think of like breaking down that third wall, then we are invited to suspend our disbelief and break down that barrier. And then if we indiscriminately accept everything, then it becomes part of us and becomes part of our consciousness. So we do need to battle back, or we do need to exercise discernment every chance we get. And like we just mentioned, there's the term programming is no accident. It's there for a reason. And that's just one example of the English language and how we have these powerful terms like programming. What program are you gonna watch? I always thought that was a little weird. Like what show are you gonna watch? But my grandma would say, I'm gonna see what program is on. It's right out there in front of you.
Well, I think a good wrapping up point for this week's episode would be, do we have the dirty dozen besides the ones we've already named? What are some words that we should stop using or that we would suggest our viewers give second thought to using going forward? And I'll volunteer one as I was thinking about the scamdemic back in 2020 when the solution started being rolled out. I would call it the quack scene or the quack or the arm dart. What are some other ones that you can think of, Jake?
I think of the evolution in the term global warming to climate change, and I reject both of them. Climate change is definitely something that we see maybe happening. I can accept that it's always changed and maybe it is changing at this time, but we're not sure exactly why it's changing. But that would definitely be something, and we've seen the deliberate uh, rebranding of what was once global warming to climate change. So that's another thing to be aware of. And I just avoid that in general because I think that it just plays into the hands of those that are trying to make normal people who are just trying to get by and just live their lives feel guilty for the using the tools that are available for them. And on that note, uh, use I will mention a term that I find kind of I brace against, which is consumer, and that is just uh, it reduces people to just an economic animal, and yeah, there's we could go on about consumerism and capitalism and everything that grows out of that. But consumer, I refuse to call myself a consumer unless I'm trying to make a point about that. Back to you on your term.
Yeah, okay. Well, I thought of a really important one, and especially given all the conflicts in this part of the world, I generally speaking will call this faux country that has nothing to do with the Old Testament and the Bible, I like calling it is not real. I think that's important to make the distinction that it really is a Rothschild invention and has nothing to do with anything going back to the Torah or Moses or any of that. And it's a completely fictional construct, which every politician who ever gets any stature has to kneel down and worship to get any real status. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And a lot of that is driven by ignorance by people who believe that really is the chosen people and the chosen land. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of bad consequences. So, me personally, I choose to call it is not real.
I love it. And I've been calling it Israel for a very long time. So, yeah, we're on the same page there. And I, my research on the esoteric topics related to the history of a lot of related things and the foundation of that country leads me to believe that that term actually comes from an amalgamation of Isis, Ra, and El. So Isis being the moon god, Ra being Amun Ra, the sun, and El being Elohim or God. And that SLC, as my late father and I love to give it that little moniker, shitty little country, that little postage stamp size plot of desert land, has really no claim to anything special. But we're talking about words here. So I also, speaking of countries, I don't like to talk about the US or the United States as much. And I started thinking more in terms of the United States being a corporation incorporated in the District of Columbia. And it's not the best term, but alternatively referring to what we normally refer to as United States of America as just America or United States of America. The United States of America is a country. The United States is the corporation that is kind of masquerading as a country and has gotten us in a lot of these issues. And if you go into natural law and how it's been used or how it works, actually, it's not really been usurped. We've just been duped into going along with this whole system and giving our consent, granting our consent and contracting with this corporation in a lot of our behaviors. And that isn't exclusive to Americans and in the country that we live in. It goes for all of the countries out there, but it's a prime example of the United States where we have the the government seated in a, a special district, and you see that with the City of London. You see that with the Vatican as well. So that's another topic, but something that I've also tried to be conscious of in my usage of USA, United States of America, US, etc.
In just thinking about earlier in the conversation, I mentioned NASA and space fakery. I think it's important, even little terms that we use all the time, such as you don't have to be a rocket scientist to dot, dot, dot. And if you think about it, when you really know what's going on, what does that mean? You don't have to be able to construct something that lifts off and goes sideways and splashes into the ocean and creates a big illusion for everyone. Is that what we're trying to communicate? I don't think so. But can we just stop saying that someone's brilliant for being a rocket scientist? I'm just going to propose that as another one.
I'm gonna have to take the bait, and we're gonna have to put a little sequence of Han Solo and Chewbacca. I mean, Stephen Hawking and his interpreter.
Calling on you for about the age of learning to because I wanted to be a scientist.
Laugh it up, fuzzball.
To close out here, because that's just a prime example of somebody being propped up as a rocket scientist, or not really a rocket scientist, of course, but more like a philosopher and scientist who knew everything about our universe.
If you are looking for trouble, you found it.
And maybe we can close on this, but universe. So just building on the term, on the idea that even in the Bible, like God breathed the world into being, right, with logos or logos, with the word. So abracadabra actually means to speak into being, right? And so we find a lot of these concepts in universe. So if you think of verse as a line in a poem or other type of writing, then we have one universal verse. That's the universe. It's spoken, right? It's if you have to speak a verse into being. So I think that's a really interesting concept to kind of meditate on as well.
I think we probably should have started this conversation with that point, and I think it's a great way to wrap up. And I just think about the first verse of the book of John, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When I read that the first time as an adult, I had to think about that and just meditate on it and try to really understand how powerful that was, that everything came to be with just a word. And just something for people to think about. But that to me, I think, again, just drives home the point that words have meaning and they have power, and that's how we got here in the first place.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and there's probably ample room for another episode to get a little dive deeper into a lot of these ideas and specific terms as we go ahead. So if this resonates with our audience, let us know, and maybe you have some suggestions, or maybe there's some word experts, linguists, and etymologists out there that want to get into some of these concepts with us. We welcome you coming on, and be sure to look for us on Substack. We're on Rumble and on YouTube as well as Spotify. So find us in all those places. And we are not elitist at all. We welcome anybody to get in touch with us. So our email will be in the show notes. Get in touch with us and let us know what's on your mind. And we'd love to have a conversation sometime.
Absolutely. And I'll just conclude by saying, I'm sure we missed a lot of terms that we should have thrown out there or put on the dirty list. So put them in the comments. And as Jake said, come join us. Let's have a part 2, and let's just go through the full list and mark them up. Until then, we'll see you next week.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.